Vasudevaya dhimahi Tanno Vishnu prachodayat Om.
Om Ajnanatimarandasya Yalanjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Suta Devi Pranamami Hari Priye. Jaya Shriman Narayana Jaya Shriman Narayana Jaya Shriman Narayana. Om Hari Om. Certain topics. What we're going to be talking about today very specifically is non-duality and personality. And what we're going to be talking about is quite literally what is the nature of the divine? What is the nature of God? You know, it's a very interesting thing how for many people in the modern West, of course, the very question of whether God even exists is seen to be a serious question. For those individuals who are spiritual people, of course, it's not a serious question for us. The reason why is because we understand that to take merely an intellectual approach will not prove, quote unquote, the existence of a being who is trans-intellectual, who is the very source of intellect. This is an impossibility. We do not prove, quote unquote, the existence of a superior using inferior means. By very definition, the epistemological mechanism that is necessary in order to prove the divine simply is not there. Thus, to quote unquote prove God's existence reveals the ignorance of the very question within the very question itself. The only way that we can prove, quote unquote, the existence of God is by doing so within the realm of consciousness. This being the case because God is consciousness. You see, for those individuals who say, show me God. Well, I could show you God if God were a chair, if God were a wall, if God were a physical body. You see. But using empiricism in order to, quote unquote, prove the existence of a being who is trans-empirical is a necessary impossibility. So for us, we don't even deal with the idea of, quote unquote, proving God's existence. If you choose not to believe in God's existence, well, God go with you. That's your freedom. We start from the premise that not only does God exist, but that for many of us, we have experienced that reality in our own lives. And not as a result of faith, but as a result of meditation, as a result of aligning our consciousness with the divine consciousness, and knowing the truth of divinity with as much assurity as we know the truth of our own existence. So, this is where we begin with Vedanta. Atato Brahma Jignasa is how Vedanta begins. Now, then, is the time to inquire into the nature of that absolute. This is how Vedanta begins. Now, dealing with the concept of non-dualism. Let me ask first, in fact, let me ask this in the negative. Who here has not heard of this term, non-dualism? Excellent, that's what I suspected. Everyone has heard this term. Unfortunately, this term itself is a term that is very little understood and very much abused in the modern West, and very specifically in the last, let's say, 40 years or so, 35 to 40 years. What is meant by non-dual is in Sanskrit Advaita, Advaita, from dvi, meaning two, Dvaita, meaning dualism, Advaita, meaning non-dualism. Okay? Advaita, as a philosophical system, has gone through, historically, we could say, three stages. Authentic Advaita, that is the Advaita as we find it in the actual Vedanta philosophy. Then what is called by scholars, and myself included, Neo-Advaita, which began basically in the 19th century, and the whisperings of which we still hear a little bit of today. And then what we have today, Pseudo-Advaita, which is essentially American New Age spirituality in the name of non-dualism. As we will very, very quickly see when we go through a preliminary history of Advaita, which we're going to do in a moment, unfortunately, what people today call non-dualism has nothing to do with non-dualism, and is in actuality more based on sentiment than philosophy. Okay? Before we do that, however, first, a very brief history of what is Vedanta and what is non-dualism in its properly understood form. First of all, Vedanta. What is Vedanta? Well, we know that by looking at the very name itself. Vedanta has two words within it, Veda and Anta. Veda means what? Very good. Truth, knowledge, etc. Very good. Anta means the end of, the culmination of. Thus, when we put the two words together, Vedanta, what we have is the culmination of truth, the culmination of knowledge, the culmination of wisdom. This is what the word means. This is an actual philosophical system which forms the very foundation of Vedic philosophy. All right? There are three sets of scriptures that form the textual foundation of Vedanta. The first of these is what is called the Brahma Sutras, written by Vyasa. Vyasa is the first Vedantist and the primary Vedantist. Okay? The second is Bhagavad Gita. And then finally, third, the Upanishads. 1008 Upanishads, today of which we only have 222, of which 108 are of importance, of which approximately 12 to 14 are commented upon by what are called the Vedantists. Okay? This is the philosophical background of Vedanta. This is the philosophical background of what today many people throw around as this term non-dualism. Okay? Most people who use this term non-dualism know none of this, of what I just explained, or at least very little, which is precisely where the problem will arise, as we'll see. Now, all this being said, the way that we know the Vedanta tradition is through a tradition of commentarial philosophers, what are called bhashyakaras, individuals who wrote commentaries on these works that I just described. Okay? Now, there are many, many hundreds and hundreds of such individuals. The earliest extant commentaries that we have are done by an individual named Shankaracharya. Okay? He lived roughly 8th century AD. Now, you'll notice I said that the earliest extant writings that we have are his. In other words, we know that there were commentaries previous to Shankaracharya. We know the names of these individuals. In many cases, we have fragments of what they wrote. In other cases, there are even rumors that some of their books still exist. However, for the most part, the books of these Vedantic philosophers who existed before Shankara are gone. They've just been lost in the mists of time. Okay? We do, however, know their philosophy. The reason why we know their philosophy is because Shankara himself discusses their philosophy, because other Vedantins later discussed the philosophy of these early Vedantins. And what we see is that the earliest tradition of Vedanta did not follow along with what Shankara and his Paramaguru Gaudapada explained and said. Okay? All right. I'm going through a 5,000-year history very quickly, so please bear with me. Now, all this being said, let's talk about the three primary schools of Vedanta, and there are many of them. Okay? The first one is Advaita, what we are discussing. Okay? Advaita in its present form, and present meaning for the last approximately 1800, 1700 years. So this is what I mean by present. In its present form, Advaita is especially known through the teachings of two gurus, Gaudapada, and then an individual who was basically his spiritual grandson, let's say, Shankaracharya. All right? This is, in the smallest nutshell, the idea of Advaita. The idea of Advaita is that everything that is perceivable and everything that is conceivable in the universe around us, in actuality, while seemingly variegated, is in actuality one. All that there is in existence is Brahman. Now, what is Brahman? See, this is the question. This little question, what is Brahman, is really at the very heart of all Vedantic philosophy. Brahman is the absolute. Brahman is God. Okay? Now, all this being said, again, getting back to Advaita, what Advaita says is that even though perceptually we see variety around us, even though conceptually we can think of so many things, even though psychologically we can identify with so many different things that we think we are, in actuality, none of these things really even exist. Literally, they have no existence in any way whatsoever. And all that, the only thing that produces the illusion that these things exist is indeed maya, the fact that we are in ignorance, avidya. Okay? In actuality, all that there is one thing, Brahman, God, the Absolute. And tattvam masi, we also are that. We also are God. All right? That is Advaita. Now we're going to go on to just discuss two more very interesting schools of Vedanta philosophy, just in order to juxtapose them to one another. Okay? You have this one extreme that says, on the one hand, all that there is this oneness. Literally, all that there is God. Everything we're seeing around us either is God or illusion. Okay? On the exact opposite philosophical extreme, we have the school known as Dvaita. Okay? Advaita, Dvaita. Non-dualism, what? Dualism, exactly. Very good. The most famous philosopher of the Dvaita school is Madhva Acharya. Now, again, to state this in the smallest of nutshells, he taught almost quite literally the opposite of what Shankaracharya taught, that all that there is difference, all that there is duality, that there are the three existents which all Vedantins agree on, that there is Brahman, the Absolute, that there is Atman, individual self, and that there is Jagat, or materiality, but all three have no connection to one another whatsoever. They are eternally distinct. Okay? Individual soul is eternally distinct from God. Matter is eternally distinct from God, etc., etc. Everything is distinct from one another. Okay? Do we see where we're heading with this? I see you shaking your head. You don't like this. Yes, you're correct to not like this. What we're seeing are two extremes. Either everything is one, or everything is radically different, nothing touching upon anything else. Well, now we come to the third very interesting school of Vedanta. This is known as Vashisht Advaita. Now you hear the word Advaita in this, Vashisht Advaita. Okay? This school is, well, it's not founded by, but let's say one of the most important philosophers of Vashisht Advaita, and let me go to Austin, is, he's sitting right there.
Ramanuja.
What?
Ramanuja.
Very good. One of my disciples in Austin is named Ramanuja. I named him after this philosopher. So yes, very good. Ramanuja is the founder of this school. This is the school that I follow. This is the school of Vedantic thought that was originally taught by Vyasa himself, who was the author of the Brahma Sutras. This also we know historically and academically, this was the philosophy of these commentators upon Vedanta who existed previous to Shankara. Again, this is not open for debate. This is known by scholars, by academicians. You know, we know this both, again, from the fragments that we have from their books, but also because Shankara and Ramanuja themselves say so. You know, so we know that this is the case. What is Vashisht Advaita? Well, again, to state this in the smallest of nutshells, we hear two words, Advaita and Vishishta. Okay? Again, non-dualism, the idea that there is a oneness with the divine, that really all that there is indeed the divine, ultimately, but with Vishishta. That God is one, God is ekam, God is a unitary being, but with qualities. Okay? And more, and this is where it gets interesting, those qualities are indeed qualitative, not quantitative. In other words, these qualities exist as in a mode of depth, not quantity. Thus, for example, if we were to say, God is beautiful, okay, that's a quality. This is a qualitative statement about the divine, an attributive statement about the divine. God is beautiful. All right, well, to what extent? Would God win a beauty pageant? Would God be a runner-up? Would he come in second place? How beautiful is the divine? Well, of course, how beautiful is the divine? Infinitely so. You see, God is not only the possessor of attributes, of transcendental attributes, of auspicious transcendental attributes, of an infinite number of auspicious transcendental attributes, but more, those attributes themselves quite literally stretch depthfully into infinity. Okay? This is, again, in the smallest nutshell, what Ramanuja says, this philosophy of Vashisht Advaita. Thus, you can probably see how Vishishta Advaita is a perfect, let's say, combination of Advaita and Dvaita, and without the flaws that are there. All right. What are the flaws that are there? What are the flaws that are there in Advaita and Dvaita? Well, let's deal with this in the opposite way. Let's start with Dvaita. What would be, this is so simple, I'll just ask people, what would be the flaw in saying that there is no connection between ourselves and God, between God and the material universe, between ourselves and other beings, between ourselves and materiality, etc., that there is literally no connection between these things? What would be the problem with this?
They would then seemingly have no central source where they all came from.
That would be one problem. Definitely. What would be another problem?
It would be independent and unlimited, boundless.
Yes. Exactly. That's another problem. That each of these different elements would be unlimited and boundless. Also, we would end up philosophically with an ad infinitum. In other words, which is the original cause of which? You see, now what do we end up with? We end up with, instead of one divine being, a oneness, now what do we have? We have kind of a trinity. You know? And this in itself leads to other problems. It leads to an ad infinitum argument where you don't know what the actual source is. And then another problem on top of all these problems is that what is then the connecting element between these three elements of reality? How are we connected to God if we're not connected to God? What is our connection to materiality? What is our connection to other beings? If we're all so radically distinct, you know, that we are isolated monads of existence. So you see the problems with radical dualism, radical Dvaita. There are several of them. Several very major ones. And these are problems which very soon after Shankaracharya, people very, very quickly saw. First of all, there is the Maya theory. This is the most important conundrum that exists in Advaita. In other words, if we say that quite literally nothing exists but God, but Brahman, but that absolute, and that we too are perfectly that absolute, okay? The only problem being what? That we are temporarily in Maya, in illusion, temporarily in avidya, in ignorance. In other words, we are God, we have just temporarily forgotten that. And what is the goal of life? To remember that we are God. Well, there's a problem with this. That sounds nice on the surface until you analyze it, very simply. If we are indeed God, and if we presently are in Maya, are in illusion, that means God can fall under illusion. That means God is very imperfect. In fact, more than this. That means that if God can fall in ignorance, that means ignorance is more powerful than the divine. And you can either trust me on this or you can do your own philosophical research. Since Shankaracharya, and again we're talking about 8th century, no follower of Advaita has been able to solve this problem. Ever. There is no way around this. If you claim we are God, but we have forgotten that we are God, and our goal is to remember that we are God, there is still that problem. How did we forget? And how is it that something can overpower God? So much so that we lose all sense of identity as God. It is quite literally something that is impossible to explain. It is something that is quite literally impossible to explain. So, this is one of the problems with Advaita. Another problem historically is this, that when we look at the concept of Brahman as that which is quite literally the only existent in reality, okay, what this ends up being is in actuality another form of what is called shunyata, another form of nothingness. It's understood historically that Shankaracharya, when he formulated his concept of Advaita, did so very, very specifically in order to combat a different philosophical system, and that was the system of Buddhism. Again, this is simply known historically. He wrote about this himself, his contemporaries wrote about this, and we know from his actions that he saw Buddhism philosophically as the greatest threat to Vedic and Vedantic philosophy. This being the case, it is understood, and several of his followers, Madhusudana I believe is one of them, several of his followers admit this, that Shankaracharya created a philosophical system that ultimately led to the same conclusion as that of Buddhism, that is shunyata. That is that if you analyze all of reality, ultimately what you come to is the concept of nothingness, because everything else ultimately is shown to be non-existent. Okay? So this is the difficulty with this. This is not Vedic philosophy, very simply. It's not Vedic. It contradicts the Bhagavad Gita, contradicts the Upanishads, it contradicts the 4 Vedas, contradicts the Brahmanas, Ramayana, Mahabharata, etc. It's simply not found within the Vedic corpus, at least not as stated by Shankaracharya. So again, it's important to understand that Shankaracharya had very specifically a polemic project that he was trying to create, more so than an actual philosophical one. Okay? It's for this reason that Advaita ended up being defeated philosophically in the history of India, and why it's only been revived essentially in the last 150 years or so, and specifically among Westerners. If you go to India, what you'll find is that 80% of individuals are not followers of Advaita. And that's the reality. Okay? All right, now let's get into actual philosophy. This was all just preface. Let's get into some actual philosophy now. And we'll begin And I'm just looking at the clock. I'm not going to be able to talk about everything I wanted to, so we'll just cover a few little things, a few basics. And this is the question: does non-dualism preclude personality? In other words, is it possible to have indeed a non-dual being, which indeed Brahman is? And all the schools of philosophy, with the exception of Advaitha, agree with this, that God in God's essence is indeed non-dual. What is meant by this is that God is a unitary being. God is a being who transcends time, who transcends space, who transcends thus causality, because you cannot have causality without time and space. And what makes God non-dual are two things. First, the very fact that God exists in a non-quantitative mode of existence and in an existence of pure quality, not quantity. That being the case, without quantity, there only can be one. There cannot be more. There cannot be 79. There can't be 229,000, etc. We're dealing with a realm that is purely qualitatively, not quantitatively oriented. That's the first thing. Second way in which God is non-dual is that God is the source of all reality. Being the source of all reality, really we could say that God is everything. In the same way that you have the sun on the one hand, yet sunshine on the other. And last week when we talked about the Shakti principle, I talked about this a little bit. The same applies for this as well, this very same example. You have the sun and then you have the sunshine. Okay? So, and those who were here last week, don't give it away, please. But we have the sun in the room over there, correct? You see the sun over there coming into the room? No? No? That's the sun, isn't it?
No, that's sunshine.
There you go. We see on the one hand that qualitatively sun and sunshine are one, to the extent that just simply seeing the sun shine, we can say grammatically that yes, the sun is in the room. Of course, in actuality, if the sun were in the room, we'd all be dead. We'd all be burnt to a crisp. But we understand that qualitatively they're the same. But then quantitatively, and as far as causality, we see a difference that's there. We see that one is the cause of the other. We see that one is the energy of the other. Okay? In the same way, we have Advaita. We have this non-dual existence as one of the essences of the divine, in that all things that exist are similar to the sunshine, with the sun as its source. Okay? Very good. Now, all this being said, does being non-dual preclude the fact of God being a personality? In other words, simply because God is non-dual, does that mean that God cannot have personality? Yes, it means God cannot have personality if by personality we mean flawed human personality, personality in illusion. However, this is not what is meant by personality in Vedantic philosophy. God has personality in that God has a locus, a svarupa, a locus of consciousness. What is meant by a locus of consciousness is locus without location. So we're not talking about geographic location. With all of us, we have a geographic location as the locus of our personality. You see, where is Acharyaji? Not behind you, he's here. Why? Because being a finite being, presently within a human form, I have a geographical locus of personality. The personality is here right now. If I leave, the personality will be somewhere else. All right? When we speak of locus of personality in the metaphysical sense, this is not what we're speaking of. We're not talking about a geographic place. We're not talking about a person with a face. Rather, what we're talking about is, again, that's svarupa. What we're talking about is God as consciousness. And what is meant by consciousness is the same as what is meant by personality. You cannot have one without the other. What are the elements of personality? The elements of personality are, first, chaitanya, awareness, cognizant awareness, consciousness itself. That's the first thing. Second thing, aham pratyaya, that is self-awareness, awareness of oneself as an existent being experiencing that which is not oneself. Okay? Third element, sankalpa, will. Will. What does it mean to be a personality? What does it mean to be a conscious being? It means to be a being who chooses to go up rather than down, to go left rather than right, who chooses at every second. We see every living being chooses. You know? It's interesting. Yesterday I was in Shram Park. And it was so interesting. It was an amazing thing. When I was there, as I was walking along some water that was there, suddenly there appeared from under me, actually, a massive crane, you know, that just kind of appeared and started flying, and it flew to the other side. Okay? As myself and some other people approached the crane, it was very interesting. We wanted to get close to the crane to take a photograph. And of course, as we were getting closer, we understood, well, the closer we get, more of a chance there is that it's going to choose to take off. And it was a very interesting interaction that we had with the crane. On the one hand, as we got closer, we could see physically that the crane was kind of tensing up, ready to launch, ready to fly, you know? But we were surprised that we could get so close. And the realization that I had in this, in observing this, was, yes, of course, like every living being, it has will. It's choosing when it's going to launch, when it's going to fly. It's not something that's mechanical. We can't predict it. Even a crane. What to speak of a human being? That's will. That's what it means to have free will. That we cannot simply predict in every circumstance exactly what any particular being is going to do. And it got to the point where we could get so close that we were amazed. And then, finally, it did leave. And what did it do? It didn't launch. It walked away. Again, this is what it means to have personality, to be a conscious being. Consciousness. Consciousness. That doesn't have consciousness. Thus, I can hit it. And I can hit it again. And I can hit it again. It's not going to fly away. But if someone were to come and try to hit any of you, unless there's something wrong with you, you'll try to get away. Why? Because you have consciousness. And because you can make that choice. That's sankalpa. That's will. That's one of the elements of personality and of consciousness itself. And then finally, Anandam, rasam, Anandam. This is the fourth element. And there are others, but these are the most important. This is the fourth element of personality. That all personalities seek bliss, seek joy, seek happiness. There is no personality, there is no conscious living being who does not seek joy, does not seek what it is that it's looking for. That's true for every human being. That's true for the gods. That's true for the demons. That's true for the ants. That's true for the trees. You don't believe this? Oh, you haven't had a plant then. If you have a plant, watch it. And over a period of weeks, you'll see it slowly begin to lean toward the sun. That is its joy. That is what it seeks. That is what it wants for its happiness and its self-survival. Okay? These are the four elements of consciousness and the four elements of personality. Thus, what we see is that consciousness and personality really are non-distinct. These four elements being necessary to the existence of both and more, one not precluding the other. Thus, it is indeed possible for God to be both non-dual on the one hand and yet also have that svarupa, have that locus of personality. All right? But I do want to leave time for people's questions because I'm hoping that there will be a lot of questions. You had a question or a comment or something.
Negativity, when you think about that, why would something perfect choose to be an illusion and suffering, but to the all-prevailing, all-expansive love that is unconditional? Maybe that is an experience, and it's just an aspect of experience that it chose to have as the playful, infinite self that it is as the one. Conundrum.
Excellent question. Excellent question. Answered in probably about a sentence. This is the problem. This is the difficulty. Still in this scenario, the perfect is lacking. Thus, it's not perfect. That simple. Again, there's no way around this conundrum. However you want to state it, the perfect is not perfect. God is not God. God is flawed. And again, that precisely is the difficulty. Trust me, that was very good what you said, but philosophers and logicians have had at it for 1700 years. And trust me, there's no way around this. There is no way to uphold Advaita without saying that the perfect is not perfect. And if the perfect is not perfect, what does this do? Well, it renders us atheists, necessarily, by then saying that there is no ultimate, there is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived to aspire toward. And that all that there is the imperfect, all that there is the limited. And if there is only imperfection and limitation, then there will necessarily and causally be suffering, whether we call that suffering illusion or not. Thus it renders reality into a living hell.
Thank you. Most definitely why I resonated with the middle path rather than the two extremes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Both Advaita and Dvaita, seen in their pure forms, cannot be upheld. And again, we're trying to deal with this very, very quickly. I only dealt, of course, with some of the problems of these. Truthfully, you can write a book on the philosophical conundrums and problems with both Advaita and Dvaita. But I dealt with only the most major ones. Anything else? Any other questions?
Yes, I had a question. In some animals, for example, dogs that are trained to be comfort animals for people who are in grief or are very ill, there seems to be a saintly aura coming from them. Whereas in so-called human beings that are terrorists and the such, they seem to have descended to a level below that of animals, if that's even possible. How could that be explained from your perspective?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's important to understand, of course, the basis of unity of all consciousness, and that is the fact that they are all consciousness, informed variously. So in other words, all that there is consciousness. Each Atman is the same as every other Atman. Some Atmans express their consciousness through the bodies of human beings, some through the bodies of gods, some through the bodies of various animals, plants, etc. But the consciousness is the same. Samadarshinaha. This is what the Bhagavad Gita calls this, Samadarshinaha, having this equal vision where you understand that every living being that you're looking at ultimately is consciousness. Okay? However, of course, being in various forms, how that consciousness comes through will indeed be constrained by that particular form. Thus, of course, you have something like a tree, which is indeed an Atman, which is a spark of consciousness, just like I have a spark of consciousness. My consciousness is no better than the consciousness of a tree. But because that tree, due to its karma, is in a physical body that naturally constrains how it can manifest that consciousness, what do we see? We see something that is seemingly immobile, etc. We see a tree. The same thing with, in this particular case, a dog. A dog is constrained by its instinctual conditioning due to its body, due to the construct that it is. As far as human beings, it's very interesting. Human beings are indeed very special, actually. Not superior, just special in this way. And the scriptures talk about this. The human form of life is a very special form of life in that with the human form of life, we have the most possibility to either liberate ourselves or to fall even more into illusion. When you are a deva, when you are a god, to fall further into illusion is very difficult because you're living in such an atmosphere and your psychophysical makeup is created in such a way that it is conducive to having a more spiritual existence. And then conversely, if you're, let's say, an insect, well, you can't think very philosophically. Thus, the idea of liberating yourself as an insect is very difficult, if not impossible. When it comes to a human being, on the other hand, we have the ability to be angels or to be devils. Yes, we have the ability to be beings who are so good that we will give our life for a stranger, or beings who are so evil that we will look for someone to torture just for the fun of it. And then that entire spectrum in between. So human beings are indeed very unique in that sense, that we have a very, very full range of mobility ethically, ethical mobility. Much more so than lower beings, much more so even than the gods, interestingly. So it's when we are human beings that free will is most manifest as far as various physical forms. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Very good.
Charlie, can I follow
Yes.
up with what you just said?
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean the human condition has more volatility in moral expression compared to like the lower life forms as well as the devas? Is that what you're saying? They have the highest volatility, the most extreme.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that plus the very fact that let's say, species-wise, the lower the species, the less ethical concern and understanding there is. You know, so this is why, for example, it's true that a dog, a cow, a horse, etc., cannot express ethical concern. It can only be an object of ethical concern. Does that make sense? See, this is where the whole vegetarian argument comes in. That Thomas Aquinas and others, Descartes, other people, tried to say that, oh yes, animals are just mechanical beings. They have no soul, they have no consciousness. We can eat them, we can torture them, we can do experiments on them because they're meaningless beings. Why? Because they don't have the ability to express moral concern. But this is what the Vedic individual says. That's true. They cannot express moral concern. You can't have a philosophical, ethical conversation with them. However, because they can experience pain, they are objects of moral concern. You see? Yeah, but go on.
This is kind of referring to the question or the comment the gentleman brought up in Omaha. I've noticed, because I'm around dogs, animals in particular, that some dogs have a proclivity to have what would be considered asura or sur, you know, like or demonic or godly, or like in terms of like the piece of their nature. Does that have to do with their karmic residue? You know, what's streaming through them?
No, that has to do with their personality.
That's their personality.
Yes. Yes, that has to do with personality. That is something that transcends karma, because karma is something materialistic. Karma does not force you to act in a certain way ethically. It is the result of how you acted ethically. You see? So rather, what we see in the fact that even among many animals, indeed, we see diversity in personality within even animals. Yes, I've encountered cats that were demonic. I've encountered cats that were beautiful, that were wonderful, you know. Again, how do you explain this? It's diversity in personality. It's choice. Just like that crane, you know, who chose to go off when he chose to go off, and even then he chose to leave as he chose to leave, not flying as we expected, but quickly walking away. You know, there's always choice that is there. Even a tree has choice. Again, the fact that there is choice is a given. What is not a given is the scope of that choice. You know, I can choose to fly right now, but I have a physical body that does not allow me to fly. Still, I choose to fly, but I'm constrained. You know, but the important thing is that that choice is there. Whether the choice can be exercised or not, that's a different question. And that is indeed determined in accordance with the psychophysical nature of the individual involved. Does that make sense? Yeah. Very good. So, any other questions? Yes, please.
Consciousness comes in different qualitative degrees. For example, if you go through the animal and plant kingdom, a tree may be is probably less conscious than a dog, and a dog is less conscious than a human being.
You know what? Let me stop you for 1 second. This is the difficulty with English versus Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, there are thousands of words for consciousness, whereas in English, there's one. What you're talking about is awareness. You see, consciousness is the same. Consciousness qualitatively is the same. However, each individual unit of consciousness in its pure essence does indeed differ from every other individual unit of consciousness. You see, you have both simultaneously. Again, you have that qualitative difference, but what you're thinking about, you're using the word quality, really it's a quantitative difference more that you're thinking about, number one. Number two, you're talking about awareness, as opposed to consciousness itself. So thus, a tree has less awareness, etc.
Yes, and even in the life of a single human being, the deep sleep state, the dreaming state, the waking state, the state under anesthetics when you're completely knocked out, it seems that if this awareness is fluctuating like that, then the presence of God is fluctuating too. And when we're
awareness of the presence of God.
In a coma, God is not there at all.
No, awareness of the presence of God is not there. For that matter, for the typical human being who is awake and alive and driving a car, the awareness of God is not there. Why go to a coma? Most people live as if they're in a coma. Spiritually, isn't that the case? That's why we have Vedanta. That's why we have everything that we're doing, everything that we're dedicated to. We want to come out of this spiritual coma. So yeah, we don't even have to use that extreme an example. The truth of the matter is, as far as awareness of God does not take away the fact of God's existence. In the same way that the sun is there, a cloud may come and cover up our ability to have perceptual awareness of the sun, but that doesn't affect the sun. It affects our perceptual awareness of the sun.
Yes, but if there is, if this consciousness is there, but we can't cognize it in any way because we're either deep asleep or because we're anesthetized, then it seems that it's a meaningless concept to say that God is there and we have no awareness, it would seem that I don't know what that consciousness is.
Well, are we anesthetized for eternity? Then it would be, then that would be a problem. It's for a short duration of time. Consciousness is still there because even an empirical physician will be able to tell whether the body is dead or alive. If they know that the person is dead, thus the consciousness is gone. At that point, they declare the person dead. It's the consciousness that is causing the life of that person to go on, even if they do not have self-awareness temporarily. And as far as self-awareness in itself is not the primary element of consciousness. It's one of the elements of consciousness, but it's not the primary element of consciousness. You know, how do we know this? We know this because, and now we're maybe going a little bit too deep, but that's all right. In our position as Tatashta Shakti, self-awareness is something that comes later. At first, we only have awareness. The primary state of consciousness is awareness. This is why Patanjali even gives that definition that I use all the time, drashtur. What is the self? Drashtur. It is that seer, is that being who is aware, that being who is the experiencer. That is the primary element of consciousness. But then, as far as self-awareness, again, that's an added element, but it's not the primary element. Okay?
Thank you.
Wherever there is life, there is consciousness. So even if a person is under anesthesia and they're not aware of anything that's happening around them, there is life that is there. If there weren't life, the doctors would stop doing their operation. Obviously, there's still life, the heart's still beating, etc.
Well, there's a kind of a vegetative existence. There's satya, but there's...
And then there are vegetables.
Chaitanya.
But then there are vegetables. In other words, you can say the same thing about a plant. You see, a human in an abnormal form becomes like a plant, and a plant is in its normal form, and it is a conscious being, and it is life. Does that make sense? So again, it is the consciousness itself. How the consciousness is manifest will change. And how it manifests within the material world is always temporary. However, if you understand the elements of consciousness, you understand consciousness is there nonetheless, however it may seem to us. For that matter, of course, you've heard me say this in Vedic philosophy, Vedic biology actually, a mountain is considered alive. It's considered consciousness. Now, what mode of consciousness? You see, this is the thing, a mode of consciousness that we as human beings who are mobile beings and have so many abilities wouldn't want. But yet it's conscious nonetheless. Let's not be bigots. Just because it's a consciousness manifests in a different form, let's not say that, oh, therefore it's somehow a lesser consciousness. It may be in a form right now where it can't manifest itself as well as other beings. For that matter, why can't we fly? You see, the gods can fly effortlessly. In fact, to use the word flying doesn't really apply to what they do. They have no weight, the gods. We're disabled compared to the gods. They look at us and they say, oh, those poor humans. And yet, would we say that we're not consciousness just because we don't have the abilities that the gods have? That they can literally exist within the ethereal realm? Consciousness.
It comes into existence. It has a life, and then it goes out of existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It has all of the elements of a living being, all of the elements of consciousness. Again, as far as how that consciousness is manifest, it will be manifest in different ways for different beings. What you're saying about a mountain, you could say for moss. Where is the central locus of identity for moss? We can't tell, but guess what? The moss knows. Because it's experiencing itself with self-awareness through a specific body. From the perspective of the gods, human beings move so quickly and have such a short duration of life that depending on how ontologically high the god is within the hierarchy of being, when the gods look at a human being, it can be literally a flash of existence. Almost meaningless to a god. And yet, to us, of course, we know we have our locus of being, we have our identity. I am me, you are you. We don't want anything bad to happen to us, Same thing for any other living being. It may look different to us, it may manifest its consciousness in a different way. It may be more mobile, less mobile, etc. Its consciousness may be more expansive, less expansive. This is why the Atman that can empower the body of a tiny ant is the same size, quote unquote, as the Atman that can empower the body of an elephant. Yet Atman is the same. It's still Atman, it's still consciousness. What to speak of an elephant? The earth herself is a being, a personality, Bhumi Devi. And yet, the Atman of Bhumi Devi is the same as the Atman of me or the Atman of the ant. And yet, it has the ability to permeate the totality of the physical body of an entire planet, etc.
Narayanaya vimahe Vasudevaya dhimahi Tanno Vishnu prachodayat Om. We will know Narayana, Lord Vasudeva, Shri Vishnu, enlighten us. We will know Narayana Vishnu prachodayat we will know Narayanaya vidmahe